Hey everybody, it's Megan Rohrer again, and we are here with Church History That Liberates, and joining me is...
Pastor Susan Strouse from Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Burlingame, California.
Good to see you again, Susan.
And you too.
And Church History That Liberates is designed to be a space where, just in case you have not encountered radical or strange facts from church history that help you think about some of the ways that people are living in contemporary life in new and different ways. Our goal is to equip you for a conversation when someone says, but they've always done it this way. And for you to have strange and interesting stories where you can say, well, did you know? And so that's what we're about with this conversation.
And also, I think that a lot of people today don't like church or think all religion is just a bunch of hooey, but and some of it is. But there's a lot of stuff that comes from history that we could reclaim, and maybe with a little dusting off and polishing, actually works pretty darn good.
Yeah, I think sometimes we think we have to reinvent everything or create everything new from scratch. And sometimes there's some stuff they were up to in ye olde times that we could learn from. At least that's what I think. I will be explaining to Susan some stuff that is also on a PowerPoint for those who are watching on virtualgrace.org or on our YouTube. You can get a copy of the PowerPoint and look at the slides yourself. I'll do my best to describe it for those who are listening in the podcast. Okay. Here we go. Okay, we're going to talk about Dura Europos and the early church in Syria. Do you know much about the early church in Syria, Susan?
No, I do not. Tell me.
Okay, so Dura Europos it's an archaeological site that is thought to be the very first house church in existence that we found in archaeology. And it's located in Syria. And so we're going to talk about what did that very first house church look like? What was inside and what were the paintings like? What were they talking about? But before we talk about what was in the Dura Europos, the house church, we have to think about what was in the synagogue. And the synagogue, because Judaism was the major religion in the area, was much bigger than the Christian church and probably was what faith was like in this community before that. The other thing you need to know is that Dura Europos was a military town. And so the people in that community likely the husbands or the men in that community were serving in the military. So some of the military imagery might be more because of the people who lived in that space, not necessarily because their faith was militaristic. So the mosaics that you see here are from Ezekiel 37. And for those who don't just have Ezekiel 37 off the top of their heads, it's the story of the dry bones. But it's the whole chapter. And so there are large figures that represent kind of Ezekiel going through this story. There's spots where there's just feet and heads. And people are being brought together, and they come together. And the Valley of Dry Bones, the people who are brought back to life, are military soldiers, and so they come back to life in order to serve and protect the people. It's sort of God's promise saying, "I love you because I brought these soldiers back who are really great." But what you'll notice about these mosaics is that the large figures are all men. Right? And so the faithful stories that they're trying to show are both militaristic and focused on men. Which leads me to my favorite thing that the Yale folk who were doing the archaeological excavations found. And before they even got inside the church, they got to like the doorpost of the church where it was common to put up messages. And let's pretend it's sort of like contemporary church, where you'd put like in the newsletter or you'd put on the church sign what your church is up to in hopes of inviting people to your space. And on the front door, on the posts out front, they found at Dura Europos, at this Christian house church, a sign that said, "Come be with us. Women can be in charge here. Women can participate in faith groups. So it was the sales pitch for inviting people to be a part of this new Christian community in a town that was more Jewish than Christian was women get to be equal in this space. And so the paintings on the inside, one of the main paintings is, they're really hard to see because they're old, right? They're from likely from between 232 to 240 is when they estimate these paintings are from. And their idea of Jesus was the Good Shepherd, which is a metaphor that comes from the 34th chapter of Ezekiel. So the painting at the place next door that was Christian, still from the book of Ezekiel, but it's about the shepherd who brings peace and the shepherd who separates people who are fighting until they stop. And notably in these paintings, Jesus doesn't have a beard because artistry of Jesus doesn't have a beard until after about 350. So this is an old painting of Jesus, and it's tiny compared to what the walls are. This is a painting or a drawing of Jesus healing the man who is paralytic, right? The story where he goes down through the roof. Again, Jesus doesn't have a beard. Much like other early ancient paintings, some of these most ancient paintings, like from catacombs. I'm showing a picture that's also from a French catacomb. And most of these early paintings where Jesus has no beard feature Jesus talking to the woman at the well. Stories that featured women. And the women in this picture of the woman at the well that's from a catacomb, they're equal in size. Not like at the synagogue where the men were really big and everyone else was tinier. So inside Dura Europos, larger than the pictures of Jesus, were these stories about women in the Bible. So the woman at the well is one of the big paintings that are in that space. And part of what has been written about this is that it comes from this idea in early Christianity, and I know this is radical, but it's what they believed, that both women and men who converted to Christianity were brides of Christ because of the metaphors of being brides of Christ. And so here's what someone said about the paintings at Dura Europos. Recall the opening pages of catechesis of both Cyril and Chrysostom have no problem describing new initiates, male and female, as virgin brides. Chrysostom, for his part, pairs the motif of spiritual marriage immediately with the militaristic imagery. To call what takes place a marriage would be no blunder. Not only could we call it a marriage, but even a marvelous and most unusual kind of military enlistment. To assure his listeners that there's no contradiction between these juxtaposed metaphors, he cites Paul and oratory usage, both and rounds out of ex ordinum, with a metaphor easily open to both genders, to join the flock of Christ. Chrysostom exhorts through marriage the military and shepherding, three resonances of sealing with oil, and the three paintings in Dura Europos baptistry. Now, this is from Peppered, and I'll put the book link in along with this podcast. But the idea here is that they believed everybody becomes a new initiate of Christianity through this bride language. So the biggest paintings near the baptismal font are these human beings who are dressed like brides. In some spaces in the early church, the human beings who are dressed as bride might be described as male-bodied. In other places, people thought of them as female-bodied. But it's not clear through this painting because we only have a tiny little remnant. What usually happens is people see the gender they assume should be wearing a bridesmaid's dress. And so we don't know. But what we do know is the sign on the front of the church said, if you want rights as a woman, come and worship here. And they had giant paintings that included women and a new way that they could participate in the church. In the synagogue, the women weren't even allowed to sit. sit inside. They had to stand from the edges of the doorways, and the men got to sit. And so there was a ranking. And so the idea was maybe that the original evangelism of the church was centered around women being equal and everyone joining the church as a woman bride.
Wow.
So here's a painting I also want to show you, Susan, because this is the oldest painting that we have of the ascension, which is when Jesus floats up into the sky after the resurrection. Up in the top, you see the symbols of Ezekiel's visions, right? Because we know the Syrian church really likes Ezekiel. So you see the wheels, and there's eyeballs and cherubs and the four animals that Ezekiel has a vision of. On the bottom are the people watching Jesus drift up into the sky. And this is fascinating. In the center is Mary wearing purple, because they believed Mary was the center of the church and had inherited the rightful space of leadership, wearing purple like royalty. And Mary's got her arms up like she's doing communion.
Which Mary? Which Mary?
Mary Magdalene.
Okay.
I believe. Okay. So it's Mary who has inherited the church and who is in control. Next to Mary are two angels, and they are beardless angels, although they are adult men, which at that time was an idea that they were a eunuch or someone who was transgressive of gender. So an adult who didn't go through puberty for whatever reason, right? So female in the center, looking very confident, very robust, like breasts that are
bust, no pun intended,
right? And they're painted in a way that you notice them. There's lots of black,
right?
And then there's in the center is femaleness. Next to that is sort of the in between or the non-binary, and then on the sides are men who are confused. Where is Jesus going? What is happening? And so the angels are pointing up and trying to explain it to these confused men. But in the center, the woman who's supposed to be in charge of the church, confident, knows exactly what's happening, right? And so this is the oldest painting we have of the ascension.
Wow. Susan. Wow. That's amazing. That is incredible. I love that. So, okay. So what year is this?
This painting it's on the previous slide. This painting is thought to be from 586.
Okay. Yeah, that is really fascinating. It's reminding me of, again, this book that we've been reading in our book group of After Jesus, Before Christianity is the name of the book. And the authors, they were really trying to get back as far as they could into the early beginnings before the Christian church ever existed, and how followers of Jesus, what that was about, what it was like. And the one chapter that we actually just read last week is called Testing Gender, Testing Boundaries. And then the next chapter, or within that chapter, Forming New Identities through Gender, Testing and Queering Boundaries. And it's talking about the same kind of thing, of that in those early days, the groups of proto-Christians were women had a very large role in it. There was no difference between men and women in leadership, and that women, in fact, were the ones who were pushing the boundaries. That women have always been kind of the boundary pushers, and that this is what a lot of this was going on. And I think this is just sort of confirms what we've been. And for a lot of people reading the book, it was kind of confusing. They were really having a hard time sort of grasping this. But this painting really sort of just confirms all of that, and I think again about the mystics like Julian of Norwich, or Julia, as she is sometimes known, when she says that God is our mother and Jesus Christ is our true mother. We have our being from him, where the ground of motherhood begins. So she's talking the same sort of thing, that Jesus as he, his pronouns, he and him, and yet talking about him as a mother, which sort of goes back to this bride thing of it's possible to, be the bride as a male, female, and, It's fascinating. And again, it's like this. We don't make this stuff up as new. This is not new. This is like
Well,
from the beginning, from the very
yeah,
beginning.
I'm sure there are people who will say, "Oh, you just read into that painting. It's not really about that," and blah 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 blah. But how liberating is it for folk who maybe their whole life have heard, "Oh, there's no such thing as gender nonconforming in the Bible," or there's like
Mm-hmm.
people didn't understand complexity in gender in the past. And this, for me, this bottom half of this painting is the whole gender spectrum, right? Like add some
Yeah.
people with punk rock hair and some piercings and right everything you can imagine of how to adorn yourself, and you can add a fuller diversity of embodiment. But I just love that when it comes to like this idea of like folk who have been like, it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, like, well, actually, like it
Mm.
was Mary, and then these
Mm-hmm.
gender
Mm-hmm.
nonconforming angels, and then a bunch of
Mm-hmm.
confused guys, some of which had
Mm-hmm.
beards and some of which didn't. And so I love this idea that there was a spectrum back then that people assume isn't there because they didn't name it the exact pronouns in the exact ways that we talk.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing that somebody didn't cover it up, didn't paint over it, didn't paint over those breasts. I mean, it
Right.
really is kind of amazing. Where is this painting now?
This is a parchment. I think it's at Yale. Let me
Oh,
double check that that's right.
okay.
It is in the Rebella Gospels, and oh no, this one is in Florence.
Florence. Okay. Interesting.
There's a lot of tile mosaics in churches in Italy that show kind of the gender nonconforming
Mm-hmm.
Christ and angels. A lot of beardless angels, especially around Ravenna, Italy, where they painted within this style quite a bit. So it makes sense how it would make it from Syria to Italy, because that was a kind of art that was favored in those areas, as they liked their Bible spicy, if that's the way to say it.
How do you think it came to be that this sort of way of thinking became so suppressed for so long?
Well, a lot of people think it's because of the different councils that happened, where men were
Well,
invited into the rooms to decide what was heresy and what wasn't heresy, what was good doctrine, right? They're trying to figure out, oh, the Trinity. What is the Trinity? What is the Nicene Council? The very first act they do, even before they decide the Nicene Creed, is to
mm-hmm.
abolish transgender people from participating in clergy, or to
Like
no
who?
longer
Like
be bishop.
how? Say more. Say more about that.
So yeah, canon number one of the Council of Nicaea was to try to argue that being transgender or being a eunuch was
Okay.
incompatible with faith life. So there were
Gotcha.
some people who would, um, well, it's kind of like Matthew 19. Jesus says there's three types of eunuchs, or three types of gender
Yeah.
nonconforming or trans
Yeah.
people: those who
Mm-hmm.
were made that way by other people, those who were born that way, and those who choose to be gender nonconforming for the sake of the gospel. We don't
Mm-hmm.
entirely know what it means to be for the sake of the gospel, but
Mm-hmm.
in the oldie times, they assumed it was about celibacy, because they were trying to encourage monastic people to be. They were having a hard time convincing people to be celibate back then,
Mm-hmm.
and they believed talking about being a eunuch or being transgender was a good way to encourage people to be celibate. But
Mm-hmm.
in Jesus's day, the eunuchs were not they were the opposite of celibate. They were the ones who taught sex education through a demonstration model rather than a classroom of speaking, if that's the way to say it, because they
Mm-hmm.
because they didn't have the same fertility ramifications when they
Mm-hmm.
taught people
Mm-hmm.
things. And so,
Wow.
because eunuchs weren't celibate in Jesus's day, we don't believe that Jesus implied that trans people had to be celibate, although
Mm-hmm.
contemporary people do argue that quite a bit. A lot of that came from kind of the early church leaders posturing for, I want to be the bishop. No, I want to be the bishop.
Right. Right.
And that's how they made the rules. There were a lot of trans people who were bishops. Augustine, right? People we don't talk about.
Mm-hmm. That's right. We
A
just don't
lot of the
talk
church.
about it.
Yeah. Anselm. There's just a bunch of them. And
Yeah.
because they were trying to not be distracted by the world around them. And so they wanted to kind of modify their hormone status or modify their physical bodies to try to be able to focus on God better. And for some reason, prior
Or
to
for
the
punishment too, thinking about Abelard, Peter Abelard,
yeah,
you know.
Daniel in the book of Daniel is someone who was
Mm-hmm.
made a slave and then
Mm-hmm.
had to work for the head of the eunuchs, and so likely was
Mm-hmm.
transgender. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego all probably made slaves and transgender in that way. And so there are ways in which Jesus was, I think, against enforced slavery and the changing of your body without your consent.
Well, yeah.
I feel pretty strongly Jesus was against that. But there were other ways in which Jesus wanted to say that your embodiment in the world, being your full diversity, helps God flourish. It doesn't diminish God. Like, God's not so little it can be squashed by one person's
Yeah.
hormone choices.
Well, and just as for women, going back and looking at a lot of the writings of the early church fathers and their anti-women, totally misogynistic things that they wrote and said were just horrible. And we can't believe that they actually said that, but you can understand how we got to where we are today. But then to go back now and see things in light of this is a whole new adventure. There's
Yeah.
always more. And to read our church history and to read um, the Bible, um, with that, trying not to have a lot of the filters that we already have, you know, that, well, I was just always, this is what I've always taught, and this is what I always thought. And, you know, I'm a white woman Christian in America, you know, it's going to be a very different way from how I read it as a trans woman in Russia, or, you know, whatever. But yeah, trying to at least to acknowledge what those filters are, at least.
And the really difficult thing about exploring imagery that is gender diverse is that Lutherans in their Reformation burned a lot of paintings and burned a lot
Yeah.
of statues. And so
Right.
while I say this might be, maybe this is a thing unique to Syria, it's not, because I found it in lots of other places. But like, even if you just said, oh, but that's Syria and they were wrong, it's part of our Lutheran heritage, because you and I identify that way, that burning paintings that didn't match the theology of post-plague times
Mm-hmm.
might have erased some of this really liberative ways that people were imagining their own bodies or
Mm-hmm.
bodies, and it left behind really just the paintings Lutherans liked in many countries. And so I wonder how many places diverse imagery like this existed but was destroyed.
Could be. I think about churches that I visited in Germany that had, you know, once been Catholic, and you go in and the walls are whitewashed. You can see the form behind it of the fresco that was there. So maybe, I don't know if you could remove the paint or not to recover some of that, but it'd be interesting to see what's under what's under there.
Well, and it makes me curious, like, you're a pastor who works in a congregation.
Yeah.
How much work would it be to paint diverse images of God or of the people of God and have them hung on the wall? You think your community would be open to it, or do you think they would be less open to it?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I've asked different groups of people over the years how they imagine God, the divine. And for some people, you know, God the Father is it. That's very, very important to them. And for other people, no way, no how. And so asking people who don't like that imagery, okay, well then what would you like? And it's kind of, and it sort of opens it up. It's sort of confusing at first when you first ask people. It's like, oh, we can actually like think of other things. And well, then you can go in the Bible and find them all, right? Just read the Bible, and there they are: mother hen, and you know, rock, and birthing mother, and nursing mother, and all this kind of stuff.
El Shaddai
So
is my favorite, God the many-breasted.
breasted, right. I tell you, I was trying, I had a dilemma though of trying to explain that. They wanted to know about names of God, and I'm talking about El Shaddai. Do I tell them this many breasted thing? I do not think we're quite ready for that. I'm sorry, you know, but it's true. And what kind of imagery then does that give? And it makes perfect sense because other places God is talking about giving birth, and it would make sense. So yeah, I think I told you the story when I did the workshop on interfaith, how Christians do interfaith work, and the quote that somebody had made that things today are so confusing with all these other religions. It's like a relentless parade. And this author I was reading said, well, when you have a parade, what you do is you build a float and you join in. And so as an exercise I did is, okay, we're the Christian float. What are we putting on our float? What symbols do we want to put on our float? And boy, they just had a hard time coming up with something they could all agree on, right? Because first it was cross. Oh, no, no cross. Oh, well, what kind of cross? There's many kinds of crosses. Well, and it was all, and then some people don't like imagery at all. We want the, just the beingness, the ground of being kind of thing. So I don't know that we could come to an agreement on what we'd have to have a whole big lot of stuff, which would be fine too, but it'd take a lot of explaining, I think.
Well, our hope is that when we talk about some of these things in history that might liberate, that you remember that what liberates one group might bind another. And if these images made you feel like it didn't work for you, let us know why. If there are other paintings that you appreciate, let us know about them. And if you are someone who has not yet been inspired by any of the paintings or symbols, ponder this week or over your life, perhaps. What should those symbols look like? If you are inclined, paint them. If not, describe them to someone who can. But we would love to see what some of those images are and to know a little bit more about what liberates you.
For sure.
Thanks, everyone, for spending some time with us. Take care.
Bye-bye.